Welcome to Two Bye Guys. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rob. Welcome back. We have a very, very special and exciting guest today with us. She is one of the people that inspired this podcast, perhaps more than anyone else. Please welcome Karley Sciortino to Two Bye Guys. Hi, Karley.
Hi. Oh my God, I actually didn't know that piece of information. I don't know if you were just lied, but I like it either way.
Well, so Karley is a sex columnist for Vogue. She's the author of Slut Ever, a blog and a book about sex and relationships. And she is the host and executive producer of Slut Ever on Viceland, which was what inspired this. And so Alex and I were on that episode about bisexual men, which aired like a year and a half ago almost at this point, right? We recorded it about 2 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. I think it came out almost a year and a half ago now.
Yeah. Oof. We loved doing that. We were so excited the day that we did it. I like remember that day. It was right around Pride. And then the show didn't air until 9 months later. And we loved the show, and it was such a great like representation of bi men that you hadn't really seen before. But we watched it and we recorded with you for like 90 minutes or something. And then it's obviously cut down and it was 5 minutes of us or something like that. Yeah. And so when it aired, Alex and I were kind of like, this was great, but like, we want to keep this going. We want more of this out there. And then we actually also heard you on an episode of How Come, the podcast, where you were talking about Slut Ever, and you were talking about like, there's a lack of a conversation especially for sexually fluid men talking vulnerably. And so all of those things you did encouraged us to do this. So welcome, Karley. We're excited to have you.
I feel extremely flattered. That was truly in my top 2 favorite episodes that we ever did, because I just think, for one, it was funny, which I think helps, but I think a big part of that is because everyone that we interviewed was like very vulnerable, but didn't take themselves very seriously. And I think that is something that is so wonderful when talking about sexuality, because it's so approachable. I got such good feedback too from that whole episode, and particularly that scene with you guys, which was we came and visited a support group in New York for bi guys, which maybe you guys have already talked about this on the podcast before, but like the fact that existed, I was like, oh, cool. Like, it's not just something that you think of. And the kind of joke of the episode was like, where are all the bi guys hiding? And then we were like, I guess hiding right out in the open in a publicly advertised support group for bisexual men.
Yeah. Well, Alex and I actually met in that support group. That's how we know each other in the first place. And the title of our first episode of this podcast last year was "Where Are All the Bi Guys?" Because like we learned that they are out there, that we are out there in numbers that people don't see, and it is so invisible. Yeah. But you can't take it too seriously, because it's like a fun thing.
It's just like our identity. Like so many other episodes you did, like these are like passions that they have, that like it's something that like very specific maybe that kind of like turns them on or something, and maybe has like a lot of stigma in it. And like I feel like the unique quality of like bi men is like we're literally bi men all the time, and like we're also occasionally having fun. So we're like having fun as bi people. So like, I feel like it was definitely, I don't know. I love the whole show, but obviously that, and then like trans relationships from season 1 was just a really cool look at like just people living their lives who have these sexualities,
Well, thank you, first of all. And also, I think that it is specific to talk about bi guys, because I don't think it's talked about that much. I think that there's an aversion, what you were talking about before, to hearing men talk about sexuality, especially in a time when it feels, like post Me Too, where it's just like women are reclaiming, like the idea of like reclaiming like a sexual space and like taking up sexual space in a way that's like positive and empowering. But I think sometimes it's like we can be too quick to just shut down male voices. Yeah. Too, where it's just like, you've been talking about sex forever and like we're fucking done hearing what you have to say, right? But I think that in order for like anything to change and anything like all sexuality to be more accepted, everyone has to be a part of the conversation. I mean, this is like the most cliche thing ever, so I'm sorry that I even just said that out loud, but like but I think that it does feel like there's a vacuum, both in just like men talking about it in general, and then also definitely bisexual men. There's definitely some gay guys in the space. I mean, Dan Savage is obviously the person to reference, but I don't know, are there more, now that you guys are in this space, are there other like versions of you?
There's some, but there's still not a ton. And there's I don't know that there's like a Dan Savage with a presence like that. It's still fairly underrepresented. And I think it like part of it goes back to this like notion of masculinity, and which doesn't really allow for much vulnerability, at least in many, straight white guys' conception of it. And so it's hard for people to balance and figure that out.
Yeah, but like all the men talking about sexuality, I swear, are like academics too. Like that's all you can find. And it's like I don't really care about like the theory behind sexuality and like how it's founded in like childhood, right? Like that's less important than like how is it impacting adults today, right?
Totally.
So I want to get back to bi men and stuff in that episode in a little bit. There's so much more to talk about, but I want to start a little bit with you. Where do you fit into this conversation? How do you identify on any of these spectrums you want to identify on?
It was funny. I had this idea when I was planning to do this episode the other day where I was like, I bet that they're going to ask me like if I identify as bisexual. And I was like, I can't even figure out if I do. It's so weird. And then I was like, I should think about that beforehand. And then I didn't. So now I can just like think about it in real time.
In real time. Yeah, perfect. Well, it's interesting that it is a tough question. What's your thinking?
I know. It's like like we were talking before, I wrote this book called Slut Ever, in which I kind of was trying to work this out a little bit in terms of how I identify. But I wrote that a few years ago now. So even over time, I think our ideas about these things change. And basically the kind of objective facts are that I have primarily slept with men my whole life, but then around, like made out with girls in high school and stuff. And then in my 20s started having like hookups with girls sometimes. And then when I was 27 to 30, I had like a very serious relationship with a woman for 3 years. And it was actually surprising to me even at the time. Like I was like, it was one of those, I knew I was attracted to women sometimes and like very skewing masculine. Like I always kind of attracted to masculinity. Like had a crush on literally JD Sampson when I was a late teen, like basic, right? Sort of tomboys, and I guess women who probably in 2020 maybe would be a trans man or gender nonconforming, but like at the time it wasn't the thing.
Right.
So they were just like very masculine women. But anyway, so then we had this relationship, and it was surprising to me because it's just like you fall in love with who you fall in love with. And then so that started to change my idea about how I identified, because it was a real serious relationship rather than just sex. But then I have had this weird thing with the term bisexual, because it's like problematic in some ways too, where like my partner at the time was a woman, right? But then I remember she was like at the end of our relationship, like questioning, thinking maybe that she would be defined as they, which they now do. And she at the time was bringing up how like bi means two, and that means that you like one of two genders and all of these things, right? Like I don't want to get in the weeds. It's just a word. So it's a word that it has been like really marginalized. So there's also a lot of power in like claiming that word. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying you're bisexual. Like I just, sometimes I call myself that, sometimes I don't. But it always just felt kind of like clinical to me. And as someone who kind of rejected the labels in general, I was just like, oh, this word feels like very loaded in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so I just was like, oh, I identify as flexible. Like that was my whole thing. And I think I still do. And now it's interesting because I'm like in a long-term relationship with a guy for 3 years. And I don't think that erases your sexual path. I think it's weird to be like, I'm straight because I'm in a straight, it's like you, like, are you gay because you're in a gay relationship? No. But then it's like, I still like something about the idea of identifying as bisexual while in a straight relationship when I overwhelmingly have like been in male relationships makes me think I just should just say flexible still, because I know it's not true. I feel like I'm talking so much. I know it's not true, but bi seems more like in the middle to me. Does that make sense?
Well,
personally, I don't care what other people do.
I mean, I think it's that thing of like we're reclaiming that word to mean what we want it to mean now, because the movement of bisexuality historically has not been trans exclusive and has not meant to, but, you know, by definition, sort of literally it does. And I've felt the same thing with partners where like to reassert that I'm bi while in a relationship, I don't want to hurt their feelings because they may assume that I need to be with another person of another gender at the same time. You know, so those assumptions are always out there, and it's hard to fight. And when you choose that label bi, we end up fighting those battles a lot, and pushing back against those assumptions. And so like, I think all these words are just a way to get to know people and for people to get to know you, and they all mean a different thing to different people. So like the explanation you just gave is a nice window into your sexuality, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. And I like truly, I think you're right. It's so personal. I genuinely have no problem with the term bi. I'm not like, oh my God, people who identify as bisexual like hate trans people. You know, like I don't think that that's true. Yeah. But I just like something about labels. I think sometimes labels are freedom, right? Like people, if you can use a label to like connect with people and to signify who you are and what you like, and that's empowering, I think that's great. And I think sometimes labels are like bogged down with a lot of like political baggage or just like historical baggage. And for me, I was just like, I literally would rather say like I'm DTF because I don't even fucking care about that stupid word.
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely true. And I've talked about it on the podcast a lot, but like this is too bad, guys. But like I have queer tattooed on my back. Like I am queer. Like absolutely right. That is the word that I would choose to use. And similar to you, like flexible to me kind of reads as like a mindset, an approach to relationships, an approach to like how you maybe react to different genders, right? Whereas like bisexual does, and we talk about this all the time, it like sets a quota, so there is a whole lot of baggage in there. I mean, I think you saying that that's a loaded term. I think most bi plus people feel that in some way. So that does give us like 20 million different labels to pick from. And like, it sounds like you and also I like search for the label that means the least, right? That like, that just holds the least water, you know?
Yeah, that doesn't box you in too many ways.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right. And wait, can I ask you a question? Because you said the queer thing. I mean, this is all like completely changing with time, but I feel like now I almost like wouldn't feel comfortable identifying as queer, because queer now in the world that we live in like means a lot, I think. And I almost feel like I'm not gay enough, like I'm not queer enough to be queer, although I don't even know what that means, because like how many serious relationships do you have to be in with someone of your same sex to be? Do you know what I mean? I feel like queer is like right now just like a movement that I don't feel as much of a part of right now to say that.
Yeah, I think there's a whole lot of truth to that. And I know Rob wants to say something clearly here, but like, no, I think the queer movement is very much so a thing. It's something that's breaking down the binary gender, breaking down that binary sexuality spectrum too. I don't know, I identify as bi and pansexual too for a reason, because those things point to my sexuality. Queer points to like my way of being, which is much more broad. That includes gender, that includes sexuality, that includes my place on like the asexual spectrum too. Rob, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can identify however you want, and if a certain label doesn't feel right, that's totally your choice. But like, what I know about you and your career, like, I totally think you're queer enough to use it if you wanted, even just because of the show, because the show went into so many queer issues, not even just like the trans episode or the bi men episode, but other types of non-heteronormative, non-conforming sexualities or fetishes or whatever. All of that is, you know, part of the queer existence and part of a queer world.
But then does it start to mean nothing? It's just like, if you've like interviewed like someone who like lives in a dungeon, are you queer? I just feel like if I was queer, I'd be like, there's gotta be a like barrier to entryway at some point.
Well, yes, but also the future that Alex and I have talked about is like the perfect queer utopia is like a world where everyone is queer, because it's about like saying fuck the rules and fuck the norms, and like queerness can be, you know, that mentality in many different ways. And so I think we should be expanding the definition of queer to anyone who is comfortable enough to claim it.
I think that there's, and not to directly contradict you, Rob, but I also...
No, I love it. I love it when we disagree.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah.
But I disagree.
I think that
No, I'm editing this out.
The way I see it is there's like a queer movement happening that is based in LGBT people, right? And then there's the movement to kind of explore sexuality in a way that is less stigmatized and less like puritanical, as the one that at least I grew up with, which was like very damaging just to like straight people in like who are perfectly straight and perfectly cis. Do you have thoughts, Karley?
No, that makes sense, right? I think that there's like multiple ways in which we're making sexual progress, and it's like sex positivity, slut positivity or whatever you would call it. Yeah, it's like, does queer mean just not heteronormative or not normal or not like constrained, or does it mean literally LGBT?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it, that it's like we're talking about breaking down heteronormativity and then breaking down like one's identity, right? Like, and those are two very different things. Queerness is kind of like breaking down that heteronormativity maybe to some extent, but it's at the core of it is like personal identities. They're two different conversations, right? What were you going to say?
Yeah, yes, but there's a lot of overlap.
For sure. Yeah, and I think we're helping each other regardless.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's all these other questions where it's like you get into the weeds where it's like, well, how... So one of my best friends, her name is Dr. Zhana Vrangalova. She's a human sexuality professor at NYU. I'm not going to get the numbers right, but basically they did a study where they asked people how they sexually identify on a 3-point spectrum. Are you gay, are you straight, are you bisexual? And like almost everybody says straight. And then there's like, you know, whatever, a couple of percentage of people say gay, which is how we weirdly, did you know there's only like 3% of people are gay, like 2 to 3%. It seems like way more, but anyways. And then there's like a couple percentages of people who are bisexual. And then when they expanded it and they asked people on a 6-point scale, if it's like, are you gay, mostly gay, bisexual, mostly straight, or straight, then there's like this enormous new population that arises of mostly straight. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, what she's saying is that people who have some gay or queer impulses or even like behaviors, whether it's like hooking up with someone of the same sex once or watching gay pornography or like fantasizing about people of the same gender, like they don't identify as bisexual. It's because, like you said, it just seems like an extreme word. And she was like, what's weird is that sometimes people who have had somewhat of a significant amount of same-sex hookups but don't see themselves ever dating someone of the same sex don't identify as bisexual. And she's like, says to them, she's like, but you have sex with people of multiple genders, like why don't we identify as bisexual? And they're like, because I'm straight.
Right.
I think that's so interesting.
Well, that was me for a while before I was comfortable identifying as bi, and we've done full episodes of the podcast about exactly that, like that group of people. And I think that group, that mostly straight group, is like way bigger than anyone realizes. Like in those studies where they ask that, like especially among young people, there's like more and more people identifying with in that range. Yeah, that I know so many people in that group. I mean, I think a lot of people, even if it's just in terms of fantasy and pornography, I don't think people file that stuff into sexual identity very much, seemingly.
Right. Yeah. Right. Even though it's like literally turning them on, right? Like in the moment when it's like turning them on, like, which is fair though. And you know, we've highlighted the idea of like identifying as straight even if you're not 100% straight. And it's like, why should you identify as bi if you've only slept with like one person of the same gender and have no interest in ever doing so again? If you don't feel like that's important to you, then I don't feel like there needs to be this push for you to like own a label that you don't really have much thought process about, I guess.
Yes, but it contributes to this erasure because, like, we've got into this so much, but it's like, but yes, it may not be that important to you, but like, it's still thing that then we're hiding by identifying as straight, and like, why is it important to hide? Like, what if it wasn't a big deal either way? So you mentioned like your sexuality as DTF basically, and like, and your book Slut Ever, and like, interestingly, I identify so much with your story of like mostly having relationships with the person of the opposite sex, but then in my 20s and later starting to have these other desires and attractions and experiences. And like, I identified too with like, oh, maybe I'm just like more interested in sex and sexuality than I thought. So what's your relationship with the word slut? What does that mean to you? And how does it sort of mesh with your sexuality or fluidity or not? Is it separate or is it part of it?
That's interesting. Is it separate? I think, well, I mean, I started a blog called Slut Ever when I was like 21, and it was always, this irreverent name of trying to reclaim the word slut, kind of like funny as a kind of like a reverent form of resistance. And then I liked that name because to me, slut was always something that clearly I saw used to denigrate or to pressure women to not, live their slutty truth. And slut was something that I was called in high school because I was slutty and like people picked up on it, I guess. But I remember when I was a teenager, or like in my late 20s, and I saw this picture of Kathleen Hanna from Bikini Kill performing like that sort of riot girl band and from the 90s, and she had slut written across her stomach in red lipstick, and she was performing. And I remember just thinking that she looked so incredibly cool, and it just like hit me like that embodying this thing and being like, fuck you, like call me a slut, okay, like deal with it, and like I accept that, and that you can hijack this word that's intended to hurt you and use it as a symbol of like power, and you can be funny with it, and you don't have to take yourself too seriously. And so part of what I'm talking about in my book, and a part of what I kind of like am always blabbing about, is the idea of reclaiming that word, because I think that historically reclaiming words has been so successful by the communities who feel oppression under those labels. Like queer is a great example, and like a lot of racial slurs and like fag, butch, like the communities who were suffering under those labels just took them back. And I don't see why slut is any different. And so in the book, I redefine slut as being like, any person who seeks out visceral experiences through sex, and who, sleeps with who they want, how they want, and sort of doesn't have like a moral obstacle, or doesn't let shame get in the way of that. Or at least, that's the goal. I think we all have shame that we're sort of constantly working through. But it doesn't, to me, mean like fucking every person in the room. It means being sexually activated and seeing like sex as fun and additive to your life and like a part of your personality. And so that I think I still identify that way, because I see it almost like as a mindset. I think that you can be slut in a monogamous relationship too, because it can mean constantly seeing sex as like a part of your life that you want to expand and like deepen and like become more fluent in and try new things. And it's not about like your body count basically, but it's more about exploration.
Yeah. It's very interesting because like I identify so much with those things you're saying, and a lot of that started to happen to me, and those realizations came as I was realizing I was bi and coming out as bi. And like I also was realizing I wanted to be like more slutty, and like but I didn't want to use that word, or like I didn't feel like that could apply to me. I think it sort of does mean something different for men and women, or like I don't even know what it really would mean for a guy. But like bi was sort of my way of partially at least saying like I want to explore more stuff. I don't want to be boxed into this type of sex. I want like more, which is all, I know that's also like problematic in some ways, because there are bi people on the asexual spectrum. Like it doesn't necessarily mean sluttiness, but for me they ended up coming together.
Well, and I think what you're highlighting there, and what I'm thinking as Karley, you're speaking is like slut is like your queer. right? Like they're serving very similar purposes of like freeing and like getting rid of shame. And I feel like it does get the same result in some ways, right?
Totally. And I think like it's interesting there's overlap too where it's like can you identify as a slut when you're in a monogamous relationship, right? Like, can you identify as bisexual if you're in a straight relationship? Like I think that these things are all really personal and it's kind of this combination of like literally who cares, but also it being kind of meaningful at the same time because it's like especially if you're interviewed about it. I feel like if I wasn't interviewed about it, I just wouldn't think about it.
It is true. The more we have to talk about this stuff on the podcast, the more I'm like, oh, I guess I think that now that I said that.
But I do think that it's like, I mean, I am kind of joking and I do think that these things are really good to consider, of course. But I feel like I've gotten, like, I remember when my book came out, I got some like hostile, cunty journalists who were like, well, how do you like reconcile, you know, calling yourself a slut now that you're in a monogamous relationship? Like, are your slutty days over, you know? And it's just like this weird experience where it's like, just because you're like reclaiming the word slut or saying that like, you know, having a sexually activated life as a woman is a positive thing doesn't go hand in hand with being like, and I will never be in a monogamous relationship. It's like, what do you're taking the most simplified version of what I'm saying. It's like, I'm talking about female sexual autonomy and just like sexual autonomy agency for all people. I'm not talking about rejecting the idea of being in a relationship. Do you know what I mean? It's
Totally.
It really is about like sexual acceptance and exploration. And it's not about, let's see how many people that you can have sex with forever until you die.
Yeah.
It goes back to all these labels ending up boxing people in because of the assumptions that other people bring to it when you start using a label.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Those people are
exactly.
so shamey. That is so like such distinct shame and also like so personal. Like that's why.
Oh, this bitch, she worked for like the New York Post, obviously, and then wrote some really kind of rude thing about me being a dominatrix. It was just it was very New York Posty. Honestly, I guess you should just be flattered that you got into the New York Post because it's such an insane institution.
Anytime you put stuff out there, there's gonna be haters. I had an article on Breitbart written about me because of some Law and Order episode I wrote. It's like, I guess I made it now that I'm hated on Breitbart.
Wait, really? Like, I'm weirdly jealous of that.
Yeah, these are life goals.
Oh yeah, it was crazy. I got hate messages for like 2 days, and then nobody cared after 2 days.
I'm curious because Rob like slipped a question in there, but then we didn't really touch on it. Can a guy be like a slut? Like what does male sluttiness look like?
Yeah, this is one that I don't have the perfect answer. It's like, of course, in my definition, the one that I write in my book, I just say a person. You know, I think that, again, I don't want to tell people what they can and can't identify as. And I think if a guy feels good as identifying as a slut, like, you know, perfect example, a guy's coming out as bi after not feeling comfortable doing that. And thinks that the term slutty is a funny and irreverent way of claiming a kind of new sexual sense of adventure, right? Like, I don't care, use it. The reality is that slut for many decades has been used as a word to put down women. So I do think that when a woman identifies as a slut, it has more of power or meaning, or it's more subversive or transgressive or whatever you want to call it. But I don't think it really matters. But I do think it's like when a woman uses it, it does feel different to me than when a man uses it.
So to get back to that Slut Ever episode a little on the bi men thing, I'm curious, like, was there anything that surprised you when you were filming that, or that you learned, or that changed your perception of male bisexuality?
I feel like I learned a lot during that episode. One thing that I remember specifically was there was a guy who said that having sex with men made him better at having sex with women.
That was me, I think. Or maybe Godwin
Really?
said.
So it was an Asian guy.
Oh, yeah, Godwin.
Okay, but maybe you said it too. I'm sorry. I'm just
agreed.
remembering that we kept him saying it in the edit, so I saw that version of it more. Maybe you agreed. Sorry, I didn't mean to steal that from you.
No. But I wanted to ask about that specifically too, because it's something I hadn't totally put together before that, but I've thought about it so much since then. And it really is true for me too, that like I felt very limited in terms of sexuality before I explored this. And I was so nervous to do like anything outside the box. And sleeping with men helped me like open up about what do I like, or what do I want to try, or what do I not want to try. And like it opened me up to actually doing things that like I had never really thought of, or no woman I had been with had ever proposed. And so it did make sex with women better when I then did that again. And it made me more communicative and open, which I think is like a key to good sex.
Totally. Do you have that experience too, Alex?
Do I? I don't know. Well, because it's tough because I identified as gay first. So I was living the gay world, like in the gay world for so long that I feel like I, unlike a lot of straight folks, got to explore in a lot more ways then. And then I feel like there were less restraints. So then when I came out as bi, when I started living as a bi person and sleeping with women, I feel like there was less of a jump. I don't know. I feel like you learn, right? Like, and men and women aren't so different. Like their bodies like have very distinct differences, obviously, but everything kind of helps you just like work towards like the goal of pleasure with people. And I'm curious what you, like if you've experienced that in some way too, of like, because you said that you started sleeping with women occasionally. Do you feel like that shifted your approach to sex, the sex that you were having at all?
Yeah, I do. I mean, what you say is interesting, right? Which is just like everybody's just a person, and like everybody just has the different bodies. So it's like if we're dividing it by gender, is it reductive, right? It's like every person you sleep with realistically can teach you something new,
right?
And changes your approach to the way you have sex, right? So it's like if you get someone who's really generous, then you start to maybe want to be more generous, right? So it's like not just down gendered lines for sure. But I think that we obviously grew up in a patriarchy, right? Like, and I'm not the kind of person who like blames the patriarchy for everything, but I think that we're ingrained in us are these like gendered roles that we don't question and we just don't even think about them, right? So I think that like it's the same within relationships, where it's like we probably in a straight relationship, the way that you approach like childcare or money or like all these other things in your relationship, you don't even realize that it's like programmed into the back of your brain to have some of these certain kind of expectations. So then I found when I was in a gay relationship that there was things that that is a blank slate almost, that you're coming at it from the same place, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
Rob's nodding. So I think that was the same with sex for me, which is just like dumb thing. Who comes first? Things like that. How many times do people come? How long do we have sex for? When does sex end? There's just these things that are very basic that it's just like when you're straight, like usually like the sex ends when the guy comes. Like it's just easier. So you try and have the girl come first. And if that doesn't happen, then it's like,
you just
then the guy, it's like, then it's a whole situation. Do you know what I'm saying?
Totally. And that's exactly what my experience was in straight relationships too. Like I felt very locked into like a certain way that this goes, and yes, who's going to come, and like, it's over when I came. Like I had trouble breaking out of that, and breaking out of that dominant role. I think I always felt this pressure, whether my partner put that on me or not. Not always, but I put it on myself to be in the dominant role. And I only started realizing when I had sex with men that like I didn't really love that role. Like I like it sometimes if we talk about it, but I have learned I generally prefer to be more submissive, or I like things to be more equal and to just like talk things out. And like I could never break out of that with women. And then just like you just learn about new things that you like, because I agree with you, not everything is based on gender lines, but like, I don't know, I never had my nipples played with women, or like nobody ever wanted to eat my ass. And so I never even thought to like ask for that or do that. The thought just didn't cross my mind. And then like pretty quickly into this exploration, a guy wanted to eat my ass, and I was like, okay, and it blew my mind. Like I was like, oh my god, why is this not something everyone is doing? It's so cool.
if I remember correctly, we went into like depth about this experience, Rob, right? Yeah, in season 1.
Yeah.
You're like, I'm not going back.
I just love talking about my first
Yeah.
rimming experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm thinking about like why I'm struggling to answer this question and why like that answer isn't as simple for me. And I think it is. I mean, you make a great point, Karley, that it is ingrained in like patriarchy and like the like heterosexual sex is a thing that we all can like imagine right now, and we know generally what it looks like, right? Yeah. And you're talking about it in the form of like who comes first and everything too. Whereas I feel like queer sex of any couple or a group of people that isn't a man and a woman, all of those expectations are just put into question anyways. For example, if I like when I was starting to explore it myself, we were on the same footing, so if we served different roles, like either of us could serve that role, right? And there was no distinction of like roles I could serve and roles like he could serve.
Yeah, and then, but the weird thing is that even then when you flip out of it, like I can imagine a scenario then you start sleeping with women and you're like, oh, well, I'm sleeping with a woman, so like I have to be the person in control. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, and that's a huge thing. I've talked about it a lot on here, but like that expectation to be like the dominant one, the one in control, like absolutely was there, and I feel like leads me to like primarily seek relationships, sexual and otherwise, with queer people in general. So that there has been some uprooting of that expectation, and I can just feel more comfortable in the first place. Like cis straight women are tough because like I know that there's an expectation that they've had throughout their life, unless they have like some history of being with queer men.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think it's, it's just porn is a big part of it too. You're saying we can all imagine how straight people have sex. It's like, I think the big part of that is because we watch porn, and when you were talking about rimming, I thought of that too. I was like, yeah, I watch enough porn to like feel like I would know if women rimming men was prominent at all, and I never see that. I'm sure there's 1.5 million videos if you search for it, but
there's everything. But yeah, no, it's not something you see generally.
Yeah, or like nipple play. I mean, you see women doing nipple play with men if the woman is like a dominatrix.
Right.
And it's like pain and stuff. But
right, but that was something that never occurred to me. Like I would play with women's nipples, but like I just thought mine were superfluous, and I never like thought about it.
Yeah, I think there's something kind of interesting about like the nature. This is not something I've ever really thought about, but like the nature of like touch, where often in straight sex, like the woman is like the one who's touched, right? Or like played with and stuff. Whereas to the guys, like the girl like gives head or whatever, but there isn't as much maybe like sensual touching. Is that true?
I don't know. It seems true based on my experience, because like I actually can remember like one of the worst sex experiences of my life that happened like right in the year before I came out. And I remember being with this girl, and I just like was not getting aroused, and I didn't know why. And I have this expectation that like if I'm with a woman and we're naked, like I should be aroused, right? Like what? And then I got in my head like, what's wrong with me? Why am I really gay? All this negative thinking loops. But now when I'm looking back at that, and I like have these vivid traumatic memories of it, but I'm realizing like it was that I was touching her and she was not touching me. And there was like almost no contact. It was almost like my body was like, poisonous or something. Like I was expected to be the one doing stuff to her. And we didn't, neither of us was good enough to communicate about that. I wasn't comfortable enough at the time to actually talk about what was going on and say, hey, could you do this to me? I was just like hoping it would happen, and it didn't. And so, yes, I totally identify with that. And it's helped me realize the value of like, you can just say that, you could talk about it, you can say what you want, and it doesn't ruin the mood or ruin the moment. It's like sexy to talk about that.
Yeah. The way you put it, when you just said like the one doing stuff, I think that nails it. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like the one that's like, yeah, controlling the pace and like making the decisions, basically, like the active one. There's like active, passive.
Yeah.
And I think when really we see the switch of that is, we call it femdom. There's a name for it. Like it's not just a version of regular sex, and there it usually involves like latex and like household torture tools. So it's not, you don't see as much like female dominance. It's just normal, quote, normal sex, vanilla sex. But with that, it's like inherently not vanilla.
I think this is so interesting hearing this, just because I also, at the same, as both of you are speaking, I'm also thinking about the fact that like women go down on men in every like porn video, like every bit of porn out there, right? But like men don't go down on women in the same way, and there's like an aversion to like clits are scary, nobody knows anything about them. Men in that way do not know how to please women as much, obviously, like maybe because it's more complex and such. But I think it's interesting to hear that everything you both are saying is true, that like men are very much so kind of the ones doing the touching a lot of the time, yet they're not as focused on like literal sexual pleasure as much as women are for men, I feel like.
There's been these studies done about how often men give head to women in porn, and it's like definitely not as much as women give head. I guess like I remember being surprised at how much it was. I thought it was far less, but I think it's more like women as object in terms of like a woman giving head still is to be a submissive position, but a guy giving head I still think can happen as a dominant thing. If it's just like I am controlling the pace of this, it's not about like asking questions. It's about, I don't know, like men's choices. But believe me, like I'm not saying that like that's the desirable role to be in, like exactly like you're saying, Rob. I think a lot of guys are like, I don't want to have to make all the choices. I want to be the one. It's not even like submissive, but just like to be able to fucking relax.
Yeah. So I loved in the episode of Slut Ever at the beginning, you talked about like, are bi men the holy grail? And like, is this the perfect, best of both worlds?
Offensive.
I guess my question is like, do you think among like women, bi or straight women, is that view widespread, or are there still a lot of misconceptions? And like, have you ever dated bi men? What's your personal experience? Do you actually think that way, the way the episode started?
I think, this idea of like our bisexual men, the holy grail of boyfriends, which is probably something that a lot of people find offensive because it's objectifying, because it's like viewing bi men through the lens of like your own sexual satisfaction or convenience. But it was supposed to be a joke. But like,
I'm okay with it.
But you guys can probably speak to this a million times more than me, but I do still think a lot of women are probably scared by it. Not all, obviously, but unfortunately, just bisexual men are like the last sort of queer frontier, or not queer frontier, but sexual orientation frontier. I don't think that bi men, I don't think we're there yet. There's not much visibility. There's not a lot of representation. And I think no one really knows, right, whether there are actually, that men are less likely to be bisexual than women, right? And I guess it's sort of like, who cares? Because no matter how many of you guys there are, you should be accepted. But I think that the reality is that a lot of straight women haven't been encountered it, whether it's because there's truly less bisexual men around, or because just like of the fact that a lot of people who are bisexual are not out.
Right.
And so it feels like new, unfamiliar. I think people still have the fear that like it means that you're whatever, like on this pathway to gay town or whatever it is that Carrie Bradshaw said. She was like,
that's the assumption a lot of people make. Yeah.
Right. One stop away from gay town. So,
oh, right.
Yeah. But I did date one bisexual guy, and he, like, we kind of had like a romantic friendship, like close friends, fuck buddies relationship for like years and years. And he, primarily is in romantic relationships with women, but like has had sex with like many men. Did have like one sort of romantic thing with a guy. And yeah, it's interesting because I don't think it impacted our relationship that much. Sorry, like this is like a boring story, but I just feel like he was a really like progressive person. I don't think he like identifies as queer. He's just like I just like who I like. He's like very sexual. I don't know. He's European. Maybe that's why. This is a part of it. It just didn't seem like that much of a thing. But I do think that he wasn't macho. He wasn't like macho in bed. And I think that is potentially why. Like, I think that maybe like sleeping with other men like strips that kind of like macho pressure.
Interesting.
This was a boring story, but like, was the
No.
question like, have you ever dated a guy?
Yeah, no, and actually the idea that it wasn't a thing is actually kind of nice. I mean, that's sort of what, at least partially, many of us hope for. Because like, if you're in a straight relationship, it's not a thing that you're straight. It seems to be a thing for bi people most often.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are having it from different experiences, right? Where it's like, Alex, for you, it's more, do you get more like shit from gay guys about sleeping with women sometimes?
I mean, I think more shit in general comes from women for sure. Because like women think I'm gay, right? Women just, especially when they like go back 10 years and see like me identifying as gay, right?
Right.
Whereas men will either hypersexualize the situation immediately and suddenly I am like I'm a ticket to like the MMF that they always wanted, all of that, or they'll just be like, well, he's like actually gay, but like what does that matter in the context of this relationship right here? So it's like quieter on that front, but I think it's just different reactions that both kind of disregard or misconstrue it equally.
Right. Like, I guess like maybe I'm simplifying this, maybe this isn't true, but it feels like what I got from your stories is that you're obviously both bi, but like you like, Alex, you come from a history of being like more on the gay side, and then Rob, you have a history of being more straight. So probably like the people that you date now, women you sleep with maybe interpret those things differently.
I think so.
But how?
I think you can't help but in this world, in this patriarchy where like being queer at all is like breach of the masculine, right? Like we are no longer perfectly masculine creatures for you. To use the two of us, like Rob, I feel like people can kind of just disregard the idea that he could possibly be bi, and maybe there's some assumption that he's gay, but I also think that there's no like implied experience that Rob has had with men, whereas there's implied experience that I've had.
Well, I think what women I've dated, when I come out as bi, they'll assume I've had sexual experiences with men. Otherwise, why would I go to the trouble of saying I'm bi? Because as we talked about, there are so many straight identified guys who have had sex with men, but they're calling themselves straight because they don't want to talk about that stuff. So I think women do assume that like if I'm saying I'm bi, it's an important thing to me, and I've tried, I've done that. But it's also like I do think I get that more from women who are like afraid that I might really be gay and that there isn't a long-term future potentially in the relationship, which is not true. And like I don't get that so much from men. Men are always just like, okay, cool, like whatever, you've been with women, I don't care. But
Really?
but it's yeah, like I haven't really encountered cool. The only stigma I've encountered from gay men is like they think I'm really gay and I'm not gonna ever go back to women again, whereas like women have the same fear that I'm not gonna really want to be with a woman again. It's the same assumption, and it's just gay men are okay with that and straight women are not. And it is straight women, like queer women aren't so much afraid of that. But I think something I realized, which you mentioned in the How Come podcast, is like I used to be scared of this label and this identity because what if women don't want to date me? And then I started to realize, no, it's the perfect filter, because there are so many people out there that why would I want to date someone who makes those kinds of assumptions? And like, it's great to just come out, and if people are cool with it, because there are women who are cool with it, those are the ones I would want to date.
No, completely. Right. Yeah, it is a great filter. It's the same with like saying that, like talking about being slutty or whatever, talking about being sexually adventurous. I mean, sometimes people take a second because I think we have such default assumptions about this stuff. Like one of my good friends in New York is a sex worker, and she, like when she met her boyfriend, they were dating and stuff, and then eventually she told him that she was a sex worker. And I think, he, to his credit, was like, okay, I have a lot of like really negative assumptions about what that means, but like I've literally never thought about it. So like, let's talk about this, because like my knee-jerk reaction is that really makes me uncomfortable, but I don't understand, and I'm here to learn and listen. And I think that like, when it comes to bisexuality, that it's fair that not everyone is like, making a woke podcast or whatever, like, people might not know. So I think that the learning curve is steep, though. I think that these things might make people uncomfortable for a while, and then it's not like, oh, fuck you, kick you to the curb because you don't know everything about this. But I do think like acceptance is what's key, and like being willing to be open-minded about it is what's key.
I agree. It is, you do want to allow people to like learn stuff and come to an understanding and not just write people off completely. Because I remember I dated someone that came out as bi, and then I never heard from them again. And I like thought for a while that was why, and it made me feel bad about it. And then like later I had some amount of contact with this person again, and they told me like, oh, they were cool with the bi thing. It was just the non-monogamy thing I was exploring wasn't cool. And I was like, oh, okay. That's another filter, and you could learn about that too. But like, not every, I have made assumptions too about how other people will view me, and like, we should just be having these open conversations. Yeah.
Right. You're like, I don't mind that you're bi, it's just that you're fucking annoying. Like, you're assume, you're like, she hates me because I'm bi.
Right. Well, I could
Can't
just
be my
say that
personality.
every relationship that doesn't work out, it's because they were biphobic, and like, that would be nice and easy for me. I wouldn't have to confront any of my negative personality traits.
Yes. It's like the perfect, it's perfect.
Yeah, right. It's the perfect defense. No, I have flaws. So I want to ask you about the show that you were a producer on and wrote for, Now Apocalypse, which was on Stars. I've only seen the pilot because I don't have Stars, but I loved it, and it's very sex positive, and there's fluidity involved in it, and there's some discussion of labels and the Kinsey scale even in the first episode. So I guess I just want to ask, what was it like writing for that show and trying to get fluid representation on television? Like, was it challenging? What were the obstacles you faced, or what was that like?
Yeah, honestly, the lead character of that show is a bisexual guy.
Yeah.
Well, he's mostly gay. I guess one would call it mostly gay.
A true Kinsey 4, I think he says in the pilot.
Yeah, exactly. He well, first of all, making that show was such a dream. We only made one season of it, but I think it's a good season, I have to say. I made it with the filmmaker Greg Araki, who I just was a fan of for so long. I mean, talk about a pioneer in queer cinema. He's made a lot of these like queer cult movies in the 90s, like Nowhere and Mysterious Skin and Doom Generation, and a lot of movies about like gay men, a lot of bisexuality. He's a bisexual guy. He's like primarily gay, but he had one serious relationship with a woman, and he was like this prominent kind of like cool young gay Sundance filmmaker. And then when he was like in his late 30s, he, I think something around there, suddenly had a relationship with a woman. And I think he, as like a beacon of this like queer cinema movement, a lot of people really didn't like that. They were like, you're the fucking gay director, you make movies about like gay guys with like AIDS on the run, like murdering people. And so people were pissed. And so I think that he sort of took ownership of his bisexuality, and like since has had a lot of bisexual male characters in his movies. And so this show is about like four friends in LA who are kind of like navigating sex in relationships in like what may or may not be an alien invasion. Like the main character, who's like the bisexual guy, is like seeing aliens, but you can't tell if they're real and that they're here to take over the world, or if he's just really stoned and they're his own hallucinations. It's a very silly and sexy show, but it was so fun. Just like me and Greg wrote the whole season together, just the two of us. And the one good thing about being at Stars is they gave us like so much freedom to do whatever we wanted, and the storylines are like there's like a lot of exploration of non-monogamy. Like one of the girls is a cam girl. The main character is like dating men, but kind of having like some sexual interactions with women. It's sort of like a smorgasbord of like sluttiness, really, with like a lot of neon lighting.
Yeah, I think like representation is very important and still lacking. And I just watched that new movie, Disclosure, that's about trans representation in film and TV. And you realize how important these things are because it's the first bi or trans person, or in the past, gay or lesbian person that you might meet if you don't know anyone personally is on TV. So the representation matters. It's nice that they didn't limit you too much at the network, because like as stuff is getting more mainstream, these kinds of storylines, I think that also comes with limitations. And so it was, at least in the pilot, it was nice to see how free you guys were to just write about it, whatever, and very like sex focused, which I thought was great.
Yeah, it's a pretty silly show. It's like definitely a show about young people figuring out their sexuality in a very kind of like clumsy, light way that doesn't take itself too seriously. So if that is your vibe, plus aliens,
yeah,
then you should watch it.
Cool. And so now, since quarantine, you have a new podcast called Love in Quarantine. How did that come about? And like, what's Love in Quarantine been like for you?
I mean, I started doing the podcast because at the beginning of this, I mean, like everyone's experience is pretty similar. Suddenly my life was completely put on hold. Like I was in the process of like for a year, had been in development on this pilot, and we've just come to the end of this pilot development process. And then they say to us, like, no one's going to be making any decisions about anything for a while. So just sit in the uncertainty of this thing you finally thought you were going to have closure on. And, a lot of the stuff I was working on just got put on hold. And I suddenly was like, oh my God, I need structure. And I also just want to talk to people about what they're going through, which is always good therapy. And I mean, I'm sure you guys know what it's like. Being isolated during this period, having an outlet that feels like productive to talk to people was really a lifesaver for me. So we're just it's a 10 episode series, and it's really just a kind of snapshot of like love and sex and intimacy during this time and how it's changing. And it's everything from like interviewing people who are FaceTime dating, for the first time, and like going on social distance dates and having like sex on FaceTime for the first time, and like what that feels like and how strangely it's more vulnerable than in-person sex sometimes. And things like Zoom sex parties. Zoom sex parties.
I've been to a couple of those.
Yeah, really. I went to one too. I got invited to did you go to like the NSFW ones?
I've been to one or two NSFW ones. I joined NSFW because of your episode of Slut Ever. I saw Daniel Saint on there and I was like, oh, this is a bi-sex club. I'll join. And I finally got to go in person like 3 or 4 times last year, and then right before COVID.
It's so crazy because, first of all, that's so awesome that you joined. And the guy who started NSFW, Daniel Saint, is a bisexual guy, and he was on the second episode of the podcast talking about NSFW and his Zoom sex party. So I went to one. Surprised, it was fun. I was like, I thought this was going to be like cheesy and ridiculous and just like people taking turns jerking off, but it was like kind of silly and playful, and like everyone's really nice.
Yeah.
Weirdly.
Yeah, and I just listened to your most recent episode about being, with a partner 24/7, which is what I'm living with my partner, and like we have never spent this much time together. So that was a pretty interesting one for me to listen to and like figure out, how do you give each other space and how do you spice sex up when you're with each other all the time. So yes. I like that one.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been really fun. I think, our final one is in a couple weeks, and it's about people who got married. Like, it's about people whose weddings were fucked up, and like whether people are waiting or whether people are getting married on Zoom. And I think it's a nice time capsule. And the thing about it is that everyone is so fucking sick of talking about quarantine, of course, but it's like, it's not depressing. I was like, you want to make a podcast about quarantine that's not depressing, and it's just like funny, silly stories about like love and sex during this period of time.
Very cool.
Yeah. I'm so glad that I got to come talk to you guys. It's so cool that you have this podcast. I'm so excited for it. I can't wait to go back and like listen to the archive. It's like, I think it's so important.
Yeah, well, we think it wasn't, there was a conversation that was missing, and we want to start to have it. So we really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for joining us and talking about this stuff. And thank you for doing the episode of Slut Ever that inspired all this. Because like when we filmed that episode, I wasn't out publicly or on social media, we filmed it, and I was like, okay, I'll be out by the time this airs. So it was actually really nice to sort of force myself to come out in a bigger way.
This is not like a recommendation for listeners to like get onto some kind of platform, so they're forced to come out, but it did work for Rob. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
It worked for me.
Just say it
Yeah.
on TV.
Yeah, everyone come out on TV. It's great. Well, thank you again for joining us. This was really interesting and fun, and keep up the good work.
Yeah, thank you guys really so much. This is so fun.
Awesome. Thanks for listening to Two Bye Guys.